In today's video, I'm going to be talking about 7 mistakes that new photographers make when they are learning photography and learning how to take landscape images. So stick around. So if you're new to photography, or even if you've been shooting for a while, maybe these 7 tips will help you actually avoid some of the pitfalls that can happen when you head out to shoot and you're trying to make these really great images. And these are things that I've done, that most new photographers do, and until they get used to shooting and it becomes second nature. So these are things you might have to think about a little bit at the beginning, but then eventually it'll be more intuitive and it'll become natural to you to shoot this way. So the first thing that I think we need to talk about is, this is a mistake a lot of photographers make, is not to consider their ISO. I always shoot my landscape images at ISO 100. Because that is going to give you the best quality image. Now your camera may go down to ISO 50, or your camera may only go down to ISO 200, but whatever the lowest ISO setting on your camera is, that's what you want to use. Because you'll have the most dynamic range, you'll have the sharpest images, the images will not be degraded in any way. So instead of putting your camera in some sort of scene mode or one of the automatic modes, put your camera into aperture priority. Okay, you can set your aperture to whatever you want and your shutter speed will adjust automatically to that, but you always want your ISO to be at 100. A higher aperture number is going to give you a more depth of field. A lower number like f2.8 is going to give you a shallow depth of field, and those are creative choices. But the ISO has to do with the quality of your image, and you always want to keep it as low as possible. So let's talk about gear for a second, because I think the second mistake a lot of photographers make is thinking they always need to have the best gear. Now, I did a video last week where I was in Washington, D.C., and I was shooting with my Canon M50 and its kit lens, and that whole combination only cost $600, and I was able to get some pretty nice images with it, but I was shooting at ISO 100 and I was using a tripod. And those are the two things that are going to make more difference in your shooting than the actual gear you're using, believe it or not. I can get almost the same quality image from my $600 M50 as I can from my Nikon D750 with a $1,200-$1,500 lens on it, because the sensors are all really good these days and you don't have to go crazy. So if you have a decent camera and lens, stick with it, learn it, and as long as you keep your ISO low and your camera stabilized, you'll be amazed at the images that your camera that you own right now can give you. So that leads me into the next mistake photographers will make when they're first learning. They either will have a really cheap tripod or they won't even have a tripod, and they'll try to handhold their landscape images. And this and the ISO mistake kind of go hand in hand, because if your camera's not stabilized, you almost have to raise your ISO to get a fast enough shutter speed to get a sharp image. So I would say always use a tripod, even if you don't need to, because it lets you really compose your image in a very deliberate way, and you don't have to worry about your shutter speed then. If you're in aperture priority and your shutter speed happens to dip down to a point where you can't handhold it, that's okay, because your camera's stabilized. As long as you're using a shutter release or an app or the timer in your camera, you won't have to worry about touching it. And keeping your camera still is, along with the ISO, the two things you can do to really make your images super sharp and have the best quality images possible. So when you're buying a tripod, don't cheap out. Get a decent tripod to start with and you'll have it for a long time. I know I started out with a real cheapo tripod. That didn't last long. I ended up buying a Mi Photo tripod, which was a decent tripod, but it wasn't tall enough for me. And then I ended up buying my Faisal tripod that I've been using for the last few years. And I'll have that tripod now forever. So I wish I would have just bought that one first. But even if you don't have the money to buy a $400, $500 tripod now, get one that's pretty decent. And your images will thank you for it. So now you have a decent camera, you're shooting at ISO 100, and you're on a tripod. The next mistake a lot of photographers make is they don't go out when the light is best. You want to be out and shooting either at sunrise or around sunrise, or at the end of the day when the sun sets or right after the sun sets. Now, I understand you can't always be out at those times of day, But if you want the best images, the ones that you're really going to love, the warm ones that have the great colors in them, those are the 2 times of day to be out shooting. And when I was learning, I would just go out and I'd be in a really great spot. And there were times where I was in New York City in the middle of the afternoon taking an image of the skyline. And it's okay, it's a cool image of the skyline. When I waited a little later in the day when the sun started to set, I got much better images and I was so much more happy with them. So if you can get up early, and I know it's hard, and I force myself to do it, be up early in the morning before the sun rises. There's a little bit of time right before the sun breaks the horizon where the sky gets this really great color. And then after the sun comes up, you can get some really cool images. Same thing at night. You get the sun as it's setting, but then after the sunset is a lot of times when the sky becomes underlit and you get these crazy colors, and it's beautiful. So make sure you're in the right spot at the right time, and those are the 2 best times to be there, morning and night. Now, with that being said, here's another mistake photographers make. They don't shoot enough. They think they can only go out at those 2 times. Now, those are the most optimal times, but you need to be out shooting. You can't go out once a month with your camera. You're going to forget the settings. You're going to forget what worked and what didn't work. So take your camera out and go shoot something. You can practice your landscape shots. They may not be keepers. They may not be ones that you love or want to print, but you'll be learning. You'll learn how to use your camera. You'll learn what works, what looks good, what doesn't look good. You'll be comfortable with the settings, and then when you are in a situation where it's a beautiful sky or you're at a location that you really want to nail a shot, you'll be comfortable with your gear. Sometimes when you put your gear down for a month and you come back to use it and you're in a situation where you want to do something, you forget. There's a lot of controls on these cameras, and sometimes it's hard to remember what is for what, and the more you shoot, the more comfortable you become with your gear. So get out there and shoot as much as you can. So the next mistake a lot of photographers make, and I am guilty of this, most of us are, is not getting a great composition. We will plop the tripod down and it'll be at eye level, and we'll put the horizon right in the middle of the scene, and boom, take our picture. And it might be a decent picture, but if you're willing to change your perspective a little bit, so when you're composing your image, if you get yourself up high, or maybe get yourself really down low, and Eric is one of the best at doing this. If you look through his images and just look at the way he shoots and where he shoots from, you'll see a lot of images from different perspectives, and it gives an image a unique look. So when you step up to the edge of something and it's right there and it's the way everybody else shoots it and it's just straight on and you're at eye level, it's going to look like if you walked up to it and took a picture of it. But if you can somehow change the look of that same scene for the viewer, it's going to be a more interesting image. So when we're talking about composition, changing your perspective is one thing that you can do. But another mistake is people don't have a subject in their image. So what are you taking a picture of it? Is it just a vast open space, maybe just a mountain range? Is there anything in your image? Is there anything of interest in your image? These 2 images I took a couple of months ago down in Myrtle Beach. I got up early, it was the right time of day, the light was perfect, and I was standing there on the beach with my tripod. Everything was the way it should be, and I took a picture of this sunrise. And it's a nice picture. But I waited a couple of minutes because I saw a couple running down the beach. And as soon as they came into my frame, I took another image. And I think the one with them running through my shot is actually a more interesting image than the one without them in it. So because there's something in there, there's a focal point, there's a little story. You don't know, this, what are they doing? There's a couple running through this. They're out for their morning jog. Otherwise, it's just a sunrise. When we shot in New York City, we used these pylons, and this is a very famous scene. You'll see this in a lot of images. This is like one of those bucket list shots that photographers get when they're in New York. But there's a reason for it, because these pylons add interest to the image. Now, you could walk 10 feet away from this and not have them in the shot, and it's just water leading up to the city. But because you get these in the image, it creates a more interesting shot, and there's more you can do with this composition. Now, in this image, I actually went one step further, moved my tripod back, and incorporated the rocks that were in front of me also. So now there's really some depth to this image. You have the rocks in the foreground, you have the pylons coming out of the water in the middle, and you have the city skyline in the back. So you want to create interest in your image. And another way to do this is with leading lines. So if you have maybe a train track or some sort of railing or just anything that leads the viewer to the focal point of your image, a fence. There's a lot of ways that you can do this, but your composition matters. Don't just walk up to something and take a shot. Spend a few minutes, look around, see if there's something you could put in the foreground. If you're standing on the beach, maybe you can find a piece of driftwood or a big shell to put in the foreground of your image. If you're shooting a sky, maybe like you're shooting a scene of mountains, maybe you can find a barn or something to put in the image also, something that'll draw some attention in the image and give it anchor it, a focal point. So these are some tips for composition. The seventh and last thing I'm going to talk about is when you're shooting your image, not to overexpose it. How do you do that? You're relying on your camera, you're using your light meter inside, and you want to make sure that everything is properly exposed. And if your meter is zeroed out in the middle inside your camera, that's great. But that doesn't mean the image is not going to be overexposed in some parts. So that's where your histogram comes in. Now, I have my camera here. On the back of your camera, you have a histogram. Now, this image right here that I have on the back of the camera, that image I shot at a Jellystone campground a couple of weeks ago. And if you look at these screenshots I took of the original image and then the edited image, you can see that in the original image, it was very underexposed, except for one spot all the way to the right of that histogram. You can see inside the doorway of the cabin is overexposed. And when I corrected for it while I was editing, you can see that now the histogram is more balanced. I brought all the colors more towards the middle of the histogram, and there's nothing all the way to the right side of the histogram. The histogram basically on the right side of it will be your overexposed parts of the image, and then as you go to the left, it's the darker parts of the image. So the first one shows all the information is in the darker parts of the image with very little in the brighter parts. Now, if you take a shot and you look at your histogram in your camera, it'll show you if everything's piled up to the right side of your image. You don't want that. So you're going to want to dial down your exposure or use your exposure compensation to darken your image, or some way make the image darker. If you have to put an ND filter on your lens, this is going to give you better quality image to work with when you're editing. Though once those parts are overexposed, you can't get them back. So you want to make sure you're not up against that right side of the histogram just a little bit. Just bring it back a little bit, and then when you're editing, you'll be able to bring it down with your highlight slider, and you'll be able to adjust it when you're editing. Here's an extra one. This is number 8, and this is more important than all of them. And there's 2 parts to this. The first part is you want to set your camera in RAW. You want to shoot your images in the best quality possible. You don't want to shoot JPEGs in the camera. You want to shoot RAW quality. Do that right out of the gate. This is the first thing you want to do. And then with that, you're going to have to edit the images. So you really want to learn how to edit your images. You can get great images out of your camera, and you can edit them if you shoot in JPEG and you don't want to go crazy editing. The cameras are pretty good and they'll give you a decent image. But I'm going to drop some images, some before and afters in here, and show you what you can do afterwards. The scenes are not always perfect, and these cameras have so much information that they're gathering on their sensors that you can do so many things if you take the time to learn how to edit. So this is probably the most important thing, I think, is to take the time to learn how to edit on some sort of good software. Whatever works for you. We use Adobe Lightroom, but if you find something that works for you, learn how to edit your raw images. 2 cards are going to pop up here, and this one is going to help you learn how to edit. This is our Lightroom playlist, and if you don't know how to edit or you don't know anything about Lightroom, jump into this playlist and actually watch the videos, because I take you through a lot of the tools and how to just get yourself up and running in that. And then this one is going to be talking about lenses that I use when I shoot landscapes, and specifically shooting with a long lens. This is a little bit different than what most people do. I do use wide-angle lenses for the majority of my landscape shooting, but here's a different perspective on landscape shooting. So since we're talking about landscape shooting, this might be one you want to look at also. Okay, I'll see you in the videos.